The Cursed Mirror. The antique shop was tucked away in a forgotten corner of town, hidden among a row of crumbling, ivy-covered buildings. The storefront window was grimy, the gold-painted sign barely legible, Grimsby Antiques and Oddities. The kind of place people passed without a second glance, unless, of course, they were looking for something unusual. On a dreary Sunday afternoon, Amy walked into the shop on a whim. She wasn't particularly interested in antiques, but the rain had driven her off the street, and the eerie charm of the place was oddly inviting. The bell above the door chimed a hollow note as she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and dust. Shelves crammed with peculiar items lined the walls. Porcelain dolls with cracked faces, tarnished jewelry, and strange trinkets that seemed to whisper of long-forgotten tales. In the far corner, something caught her eye, a tall, ornate mirror. Its frame was made of dark, carved wood, intricate designs twisting like vines around its edges. The glass itself was pristine, a strange contrast to the tarnished and aged items around it. "Ah, you found it," said a raspy voice. Amy turned to see the shopkeeper, an elderly man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed far too sharp for his frail appearance. He shuffled closer, leaning heavily on a cane. "This mirror," he continued, his tone grave. "It has a history. Doesn't everything in here?" Amy replied, attempting a smile. The old man didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "They call it the Cursed Mirror. Many who've owned it have. Regretted it." Amy raised an eyebrow. "Why sell it then?" "Some things can't be destroyed," he said cryptically, "and they mustn't be forgotten." Despite his ominous words, Amy found herself drawn to the mirror. She didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but there was something captivating about it, a strange allure that tugged at her curiosity. "How much?" she asked, almost without thinking. The shopkeeper hesitated before naming a price that was surprisingly low. "Take it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But remember, some reflections show more than the surface." The mirror fit perfectly in the corner of Amy's living room. Its dark frame added an air of elegance to the otherwise modern space. She often caught herself admiring it, though she couldn't quite explain why. The first incident happened late one night. She was passing through the living room on her way to bed when she noticed something strange. In the faint light filtering through the curtains, the mirror seemed to shimmer, as if the glass were rippling like water. Amy froze, staring at the surface. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, shadows shifting in the depths of the reflection. She shook her head, blaming her fatigue, and went to bed. But the visions grew worse. The following nights, the mirror began showing things that weren't there. It started subtly, a flicker of motion in the corner of her eye, a shadow darting across the glass. Then, one night, she saw herself in the reflection, but her mirrored self was smiling. Amy wasn't. The smile was wide, too wide, and her reflection's eyes seemed darker, almost hollow. She turned away, her heart pounding, but when she looked back, the reflection was normal again. She told herself it was her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. It wasn't long before the nightmare started. Amy would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. The dreams were vivid and horrifying, filled with distorted images of herself, her face twisted in agony as unseen hands dragged her into the depths of the mirror. During the day, the mirror seemed benign, almost ordinary. But at night, it became something else entirely. The reflections grew more disturbing, glimpses of dark, writhing shapes that didn't belong in her living room. Sometimes, she thought she heard faint whispers coming from its direction, though the words were unintelligible. One evening, she decided she'd had enough. Armed with a blanket, she covered the mirror and vowed to get rid of it the next day. But the blanket didn't stay. When she woke the next morning, it was folded neatly on the floor, as if the mirror had rejected her attempt to hide it. Amy's friends began noticing her change. She looked pale and exhausted, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. She became jumpy, irritable, and withdrawn. "You okay, Amy?" her best friend Sarah asked one afternoon. "I'm fine," Amy lied, forcing a smile. "Are you sure? You look tired. And, honestly, you've been acting strange lately." Amy wanted to confide in Sarah, to tell her about the mirror, but she knew how ridiculous it would sound. Instead, she shrugged it off and changed the subject. That night, the mirror showed her something new. She saw Sarah, her face contorted in terror, screaming as dark hands pulled her into a void. The vision was so vivid that Amy stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. The glass didn't shatter. Instead, it seemed to pulse, as if alive. Desperate, she turned to the internet, searching for anything about cursed mirrors. She found stories, urban legends, tales of haunted antiques, but nothing concrete. The only advice repeated over and over was this: never break the mirror. The following days were a waking nightmare. The visions became constant, haunting her even in daylight. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent sentences. "You can't escape. It sees everything. You belong to it now." Amy tried moving the mirror to the garage, but the next morning, it was back in its place, as if it had never left. She began seeing things in her apartment, dark shapes flitting just out of sight, fleeting touches that made her skin crawl. Her friends stopped visiting, alarmed by her increasingly erratic behavior. The final straw came one night when she woke to find the mirror glowing faintly, its surface swirling like liquid. A hand emerged from the glass, a pale, skeletal hand that reached out toward her. Screaming, Amy fled the apartment and checked into a motel. She didn't return for days, but even there, the nightmares followed her. The whispers seemed to echo in her mind, growing louder with each passing day. When she finally returned home, the mirror was waiting for her, its surface pristine and still. In a fit of desperation, Amy called a priest, a self-proclaimed medium, and even a paranormal investigator. None of them could help. The medium refused to even enter the apartment, her face pale with fear. "This is beyond me," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to destroy it." Amy hesitated, remembering the warnings about breaking the mirror. But she couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a hammer, she stood before the mirror, her hands shaking. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices begging, threatening, pleading. "Don't do it," they hissed. With a scream, Amy swung the hammer. The glass shattered, and a deafening roar filled the room. For a moment, there was silence. Then the shards began to move, sliding across the floor as if pulled by an invisible force. The pieces reassembled themselves, forming a new, smaller mirror. And in its surface, Amy saw her own reflection, her face frozen in a silent scream. The whispers stopped. The room was quiet. Amy was never seen again. But the mirror remains, waiting for its next owner.